guess we'll start. So this was your question for last week. How did everyone do on that? You think you got the right answer? Anyone really confident besides you? And besides everyone who's taken my class, anyone really confident you got the right answer? Which of these was not an idol? You think you got it? Oh, cool. All right. Well, you think you got it. All right. Well, let's do it. Let's go into it. So this week is the 5th week. We're going to go through the second commandment, which is a very interesting one. So we're right on schedule. So let's just kind of jump in. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to read the text of this commandment. So let's go to Exodus 20, verses 4 through 6. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the 3rd and 4th generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. All right, so let's see how this is expanded. So here's the text of the command. Now let's see how this is kind of expanded, and basically let's outline what we're going to do today. So the meaning and expansions of this, we're going to look at idolatry. Obviously, this is the primary thrust of this whole commandment. So idolatry, which is worshiping something made by man as God. And this is very clear from the text. This happens all throughout the Old Testament. This is very much the direct point of this command. However, if this was all that this command meant, simply don't worship idols, then this would pretty much be completely absorbed in the whole first commandment, kind of like the Catholics do, where they lump these two together. So this is actually not the case. There is a little bit more to this command. We're going to look at sacrilege, which is kind of the reverse of idolatry. It's treating holy things as unholy. So in idolatry, you treat normal things like this as a god. You elevate a golden calf as a god. Sacrilege is you take holy things and treat them in an unholy way. You kind of reverse the idea of idolatry. And we're going to see how that shows up in Scripture. And then together, both of these ideas give us a good way of thinking about the proper worship of God. So how to worship Him correctly and incorrectly. And we'll go through that this week. So starting right in, we're going to look at idolatry itself. So looking at the first aspect of this command, let's read it again. Right here it is. In fact, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, nor that is in the water under the earth. Okay, stop right there. If you're in Exodus 20, also turn to Numbers 21. So this is somewhat of a case study for idolatry, and this gives us a good nuanced understanding of what it is. So Exodus 20 verse 4 said, don't make any graven image of any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Numbers 21, 8 through 9 says, and the Lord said unto Moses, make thee a fiery serpent, and set it upon a pole. And it shall come to pass that every one that is bitten, when he looketh upon it, shall live. And Moses made a serpent of brass, and put it upon a pole. And it came to pass that if a serpent had bitten any man, when he beheld the serpent of brass, he lived. This is a little strange here. God says, don't make any graven image. And then immediately he says, go make a graven image of a very specific thing that lives on earth today. So did we really just read an instance where God contradicted himself, where he says, don't make an image, and then, real quick, make an image? In fact, he said it to the same people. Moses got the commandments, and then Moses got this command to make an image. The same people who received the commandments at the base of Mount Sinai were the ones tempting God in the wilderness and got bit by these serpents. I think we all, I don't need to read the context for that, the story, Numbers 21, but it's the Israelites were tempting Moses. They were rebelling against God, and God sent the serpents to bite them and kill them as a judgment. And this was how they got saved from that, through the looking at the brass serpent. So since God can't contradict himself, how are we supposed to read this? This obviously is solved for us when we look at verse 5 of Exodus 20. And it says, thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, so on and so forth. So the idea is not that the images themselves are not the idol. They're not the sin. the bowing down to them is the sin. It's a two-part command. Don't make the images that you will bow down to. But you apparently can make images as long as you don't worship them. So clearly verse 5 here is doing quite a lot of heavy lifting in this commandment, and it is the worship of the image that is the sin, not the image itself. So a definition for idolatry would then be the worship of idols, images, or anything made by hands or which is not God, excessive attachment or veneration for anything or that which borders on adoration. So it's not just the presence of the image, the presence of the idol. That part is apparently okay from this one example we gave, but the worship of it is not. So let's look at some other examples that we see in the Old Testament. So the golden calf. Right at this moment, Jesus was giving the command to don't make images, and then they make this image, and Aaron definitely messed up. So like we talked about last week, at literally the same time that God is giving the command, Aaron and the Israelites are breaking it, making this golden calf. So very poor job, Aaron, you messed up. Another example is the brass serpent. So we looked at that briefly, but let's dive in a little more. I think this is the best case study for really fleshing out what idolatry is. So let's read the story of the brass serpent again in Numbers 21, 4 through 9. Which says, "And they journeyed from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to compass the land of Edom, and the soul of the people was much discouraged because of the way. And the people spake against God and against Moses, Wherefore have ye brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no bread, neither is there any water, and our soul loatheth this light bread." This light bread, by the way, is manna, so they're eating miracle food, and they're griping about it. "And the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and much people of Israel died. Therefore the people came to Moses and said, We have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against thee. Pray unto the Lord that he take away the serpents from us. And Moses prayed for the people. And the Lord said unto Moses, Make thee a fiery serpent, and set it upon a pole, and it shall come to pass that every one that is bitten, when he looketh upon it, shall live. And Moses made a serpent of brass, and put it upon a pole, and it came to pass that if a serpent had bitten any man, when he beheld the serpent of brass, he lived." Okay, so here we see that Moses was directly and unambiguously told to make an image of a serpent, and God would use it to create miracles. And interestingly, it's miracles on demand. He had this thing. When you did a thing to that thing, a miracle happened. So it's pretty amazing. And it's a pretty remarkable story. And this was a direct command from God. So unambiguously, what Moses did was correct and good, because God literally told him to. And he told us to, and he, let's see. However, if we turn to 2 Kings, so this is kind of a second half to this story. So 2 Kings 18, verses 3 through 6. We see something interesting happen. This happens in the reign of King Hezekiah. 18:3 through 6 says, "And he," speaking of Hezekiah, "did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that David his father did. And he removed the high places, and brake the images, and cut down the groves, and brake in pieces the brazen serpent that Moses had made. For unto those days the children of Israel did burn incense to it. And he called it Nehushtan." Nehushtan is a word that means a piece of brass. He's seemingly minimizing the effect and the real significance of this item. Continuing reading on, "He trusted in the Lord God of Israel, so that after him," speaking of Hezekiah again, "was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor any that were before him. For he clave to the Lord and departed not from following him, but kept his commandments, which the Lord commanded Moses." So this is interesting. It seems that after Moses was finished with the serpent, the Israelites kept it. And of course they would. It was a miraculous thing. It was a very famous, important piece of their history. Of course they would keep it. They kept it as a memorial and to remind the people of the miracles that happened. However, many years later, this is something like 400 years later, or about that, they began to worship it. And in that time, Hezekiah had to destroy it, which God tells us was also a good thing. So it's interesting, the response of the people. When they first made it, it was a good thing. When they started to worship it and they destroyed it, that was a good thing. So it's not the item itself. It's our response to it, or their response to it in this case. In fact, if you read in the New Testament, John 3, 14 through 15, Jesus uses the brass serpent as an object lesson. Let me read that to you. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have eternal life. So it seems to me that God intended the brass serpent to be a physical and visible object lesson that would point to Jesus when he eventually came, and to his crucifixion specifically. But the idolatrous worship of the object warranted its destruction instead. I think it's right to conclude from this case study that religious imagery and statues are not inherently evil. They can be useful tools to point us to Christ. However, the pervasiveness of Catholic-style worship of these things will probably steer us away from them. So basically in our daily practice, having statues of the saints, for example, like Moses, just sitting over here, it's not inherently bad. However, because we're steeped in Catholic-style, especially in New England, Catholic-style religion, it might be a stumbling block to some people. So prudence maybe would warrant that we don't have statues all over the church. However, I think it's very important for us to realize the statues themselves are not the problem. It's our worship of them, or other people's worship of them. If we had lived in a culture free from Catholic influence, I think we would probably see much more Christian art in Baptist churches, and I think we'd be better off for it. In the case of the brass serpent, I think it would have been a really important lesson for the people of Jesus' day if he had gone into the temple, seen the serpent, pointed to it, and said, "I will be like that," raised up before everyone to save everyone from the sin that pervades all of society. I think that would have been a really interesting, very direct physical object lesson, and that seems to have been the original intent of the brass serpent, or its secondary intent, I guess. And this happens a lot in Old Testament. Actually, it's pretty much the predominance of Old Testament. There is a figure in the Old Testament, a thing that has an immediate application in the Old Testament that will eventually be used to point to Christ. And I think it is a shame that Hezekiah had to destroy it, although it was a good thing that he did. I think it would have been much better if they had simply avoided breaking the second commandment. They didn't worship the thing, but they held on to it as a wonderful object lesson that when Jesus came would point to him. All right, so more examples of idolatry, selfies. So this is a very modern one, but if you worship yourself, as I think most modern people do, then selfies can become a form of idolatry. If you are an influencer, or whatever they call it, and you are always posting selfies online, you are dolling yourself up, taking selfies. Oh, look what a wonderful person, look what I'm doing. I'm here at the beach, I'm here at the whatever. You are probably worshiping yourself. It's not necessarily true. Obviously, selfies are not necessarily a form of worship, just like the brass serpent was not necessarily an idol. But if you are self-obsessed, you need to be careful of yourself. If you are posting selfies, those essentially become an idol through which you can worship yourself, and I guess your fans could worship you. So be careful of that. Mary. So in your little take-home question, your your multiple choice, we looked at the brass bowl. Now let's look at Mary in the bathtub. So obviously, up here in New England, we see it a lot, or I guess not as much as I would have expected, but we see plenty of statues of Mary. You see her in bathtubs on the side of the road. You see her in a lot of Catholic churches, obviously. She is everywhere. And the Catholics put an absurd level of veneration on to Mary. They literally pray to her. They bow to her. They ask her for forgiveness. They pray to her and they do other things that really should just be reserved for God. So it's not that she herself in the image is an idol. However, her constant adoration of her clearly becomes idolatry. So obviously, in that case, Mary would be an idol. So let me read to you a prayer. So this is a Catholic prayer. It's called the Prayer to Our Lady, Queen of Hope. And here's the quote. "O Mother of Mercy, have pity on me in my distress. You are all-powerful with your divine Son. He can refuse no request of your immaculate heart. Show yourself a true mother to me by being my advocate before his throne, O refuge of sinners and hope of the hopeless, to whom shall I turn if not you?" So all throughout that prayer, you heard language that really should have been directed at Jesus. Like, Jesus is our refuge and strength. He's our hope. Obviously, he can refuse to do things that Mary asks him. That's a ridiculous statement. I don't know where that came from. In fact, when when he was on earth, and they said, Mary wants to talk to you, and Jesus basically said no. So clearly we have scriptural proof that Jesus can refuse Mary's request, but the Catholics they just go way out in left field with this. They try very hard to state that they don't worship Mary, and they basically split hairs on the way they define words such as veneration. But in actual practice, and the results of what they do and what they believe, it is very clearly worship of Mary. And that's besides all the specific prayers. It's what they believe about her in specific. It's very clearly they worship Mary. All right, another example, and a very important one, the Eucharist. So this, if you've never been in a Catholic church, I've never seen this in real life, but this is the Eucharist, the wafer. This is what they believe. This is, for us, obviously, as Baptists, we do the Lord's Supper. This is their version of that. They have a very different understanding of what it is for them. But when they have the Mass, when they give the Eucharist, it's very common to kneel and bow before accepting the wafer. In fact, in a lot of traditional Masses, you line up, you bow, you kneel in front of the priest, and he gives it to you. They have lots of special rules about you can't chew it. They put it on your tongue. You let it dissolve. You don't bite it and chew it. A lot of strange things they do. And these are all things designed to show reverence and worship for the Eucharist. And so why do they worship it? They worship it because they believe that the cracker is literally and truly Jesus' body. Unleavened bread is a cracker. Let me read something for you. Pope Benedict XVI, who was a very recent pope, he was from 2005 to 2022. He says this: the practice of kneeling for Holy Communion has in its favor a centuries-old tradition, and it is a particularly expressive sign of adoration, completely appropriate in the light of the true, real, and substantial presence of our Lord Jesus Christ under the consecrated species. So they believe that Jesus is actually present in the cracker. If this were true, if the cracker was actually Jesus, then everything they do would actually be appropriate. If Jesus was literally here, it would be perfectly appropriate for you to bow and worship him because he is God. He's not usurping authority. He's not requesting worship that isn't due to him. He's obviously the one we worship on a daily basis, or we should worship on a daily basis. So if it was the case that Jesus is the cracker, then their worship of the cracker would be appropriate, and all this very fancy imagery and idolatry essentially would be true. Also, as a side note, this is how we know Jesus was white. He's a cracker. So the Catholics genuinely believe that the cracker, which was made by the hands of man every week, becomes God, and they worship it as such. So this is the textbook definition of idolatry. A thing that made by hands is worshipped as God. Now, it's just splitting hairs that they believe he's God. They are incorrect. If they were correct, they'd be fine to do it, but they are not. So it is classic idolatry. So now that we've kind of worked through idolatry, what do you think about this question again? Which one did you all pick? Let's just go through it. Who thinks A was not an idol? Not an idol. Okay, who thinks B was not an idol? Who thinks C was not an idol, the brass serpent? Who thinks D, Mary in the bathtub, was not an idol? Okay. I think a bunch of you got it right. So which of these? The correct answer is A. This is interesting. That picture was right from this. This is the Old Testament temple. This is the Solomon's temple, or an image of it, obviously. This comes from 1 Kings 7:23 through 26. That says, and he, this is Solomon, or the builders, I guess, made a molten sea, 10 cubits from one brim to the other. It was round about, and its height was 5 cubits. When it was cast, it stood upon 12 oxen, 3 looking toward the north, and 3 looking toward the west, and 3 looking toward the south, and 3 looking toward the east. And the sea was set above them, and all their hinder parts were inward, and it was a handbreadth thick, and the brim thereof was wrought like the brim of a cup, with flowers of lilies. It contained 2,000 baths, which is a unit of volume. So this is a description of a laver, which was essentially a giant wash bowl that the priests would use daily to wash themselves and wash certain things. This was a part of the daily sacrificial system. Daily worship of God involved brass oxen. Isn't that interesting? In one case, a golden calf was a terrible sin. In this case, something essentially the same is something God commanded to use for worship. And this is God's describing it to them, telling them how to build it. And this is very interesting, isn't it? Hopefully, I think this helps to drive home the idea that the image or the statue itself is not the sin. Even having them as part of your worship is not a sin, but worshiping them is a sin. So a lot of the problem with idolatry here is, where's the line? Where's the line of worshiping the image or just being respectful of the image? Where is the line where the Catholics have a really hard time with this, where if they see a picture of a saint, actually Pastor was telling me last week that if you go to St. Peter's Basilica, you go to the Vatican City in Rome, there's lots of statues of saints, and a lot of them have their toes worn off because people walk by and touch them and say a prayer to the saint to help them with whatever the saint is really good at helping them with, apparently. And that is worship. That is going too far. When you're praying to an image or praying to the thing the image represents and it's not God, that's idolatry. I think it's a little bit of a blurry line sometimes. If you are looking at a great work of art like this one, and you're saying, "Oh wow, that is marvelous! Look how beautiful it is! Look at the wonderful thing God created for, or God had them create for us." And if it points itself to God, that is a good thing. If you start worshiping the thing that points to God, like in this case the brass bowls or the fiery serpent, that is a bad thing. So it is not the item itself. It's our response to the item that is the key part. I think our instincts as Baptists are to be directly contrary to the Catholics, especially here in New England where so many people were Catholics, like Reggie. You were a Catholic for a long time. You were even... You went to catechism, right? You went to, or whatever the Catholic school is. You were an altar boy. Yeah, you went to seminary. So you have a deep Catholic background. All this, does this sound about right? This is the issue, where if you are coming out of a sin or a false religion that had a severe issue with these things, your level of tolerance for icons and art is going to be very different than someone like me who was never a Catholic. So we all have to have our own balance in our own lives, and I think as Baptists, I think we kind of go too far. I think we even go in an unhealthy direction, to an unhealthy level, where almost no Baptist church anywhere in the U.S. has any form of imagery, any form of art that depicts anything in the Old Testament. There are some who have it. I think a lot of it's financial issues. If they're not, art, it's expensive. Even pretty poor art can be expensive. But I think generally the idea from Baptists is we need to be the opposite of Catholics. And I don't think that's healthy. We need to have a proper balance. So just as an example, St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City in Rome is more like the temple that God designed than any of our modern Baptist churches. Think about that. If God came back, when God comes back, he's going to make a temple. Is that temple going to be bland? No. It's going to be like this. It's going to be made of gold. It's going to have detailed work. It's going to have images of bulls, perhaps, images of oxen and other things. And there's descriptions of fruit on these pillars over here. These pillars apparently were crowned with tiny, tiny little images of fruit, and it was a extremely skillful work of art, the entire temple was, and it was beautiful, and it pointed to God in many, many different ways. That is the ideal of imagery for the Old Testament, and I think it's the same for the New Testament. It would be good for us to have imagery that pointed to Christ. However, just like we saw in the brass serpents example, which was designed to point to Christ, they abused it. So it is kind of up to us to decide how far we go with it. But I think our instincts need to be dulled a little bit in this case. I think it would be perfectly acceptable for modern Baptist American churches to have imagery, but we must be careful to not worship them, obviously. For an example of kind of how far to an extreme a lot of religions have gone, let me read to you from the Westminster Confession of Faith. Now, the Westminster Confession of Faith is more of an Anglican thing that was adopted by Calvinists. It's got a lot of really good doctrine in it, but it doesn't hold any authority over us as Baptists or as independent Baptists, obviously. But it says this as an example of how far things have gone. The sins forbidden in the second commandment are the making of any representation of God, of all or of any of the three persons, either inwardly in our mind or outwardly in any kind of image or likeness of any creature whatsoever. So according to them, you can't even think about what God looks like. That's going way too far. That's just a reactionary an instinct. That's wrong. I think it's better to think that God loves beauty, his creations are beautiful, and the things he had commanded people to make are beautiful. It's a good thing for the places where we worship him to also be beautiful. And I think we do a good job. I actually like these pillars and the facade back there. It looks very good, and it helps us worship God with it. A proper balance must therefore be struck between having images and icons that point to God and idols that take away from God. And this is a fine line, and everyone must make their own judgment. Every church has their own level, I think, and it depends very much on what the church is all about. If it's a church made entirely from saved Catholics, I think you'd be very different from a church that's made entirely from, say, saved pagans or saved Jehovah's Witnesses or what have you. So I think that the example of the brass serpent shows us that the balance is primarily found in our individual response to the images. However, there is wisdom in avoiding temptations by keeping away from statues of Mary and other commonly worshipped people. So I think even if you have a Baptist church who wants to have images and icons and stuff, don't have Mary, okay? It's just too, I think the image of Mary has been sullied so badly that I don't know if it's any recovering from that. All right, so that was idolatry. Let's continue on to sacrilege, and I've used too much time already. So let's look at the second aspect of this command, and let's do this by reading the New Testament in Romans 2:21. All right, Romans 2:21 is one of the times in the New Testament where we see the commands reiterated by someone and expanded upon, and it's very interesting how it works. So Romans 2:21 says, "Thou therefore, which teachest another, teachest thou not thyself? Thou that preachest a man should not steal, dost thou steal? Thou that sayest a man should not commit adultery, dost thou commit adultery? Thou that abhorrest idols, dost thou commit sacrilege?" Wait a minute. That doesn't quite fit the pattern, does it? Thou that committest, you say a man should not commit adultery, but you commit adultery. You say don't steal, but you steal. You say don't have idols, but then you commit sacrilege. This is not, you would expect idolatry to be there instead of sacrilege. So this is interesting. Here we read that Paul is telling the Jews that they are violating the second commandment against idolatry by committing sacrilege. So obviously we need to know what sacrilege is. So there's your definition right there. The crime of violating or profaning sacred things, or the alienating to laymen or to the common purposes that which was appointed or consecrated to religious persons or uses. Okay, so what does profane mean? Profane means irreverent to any sacred thing applied to persons. A man is profane when he takes the name of God in vain or treats sacred things or treats sacred things with abuse and irreverence. So obviously this is very interesting. It's the kind of the opposite of, like I said earlier, opposite of idolatry. Idolatry is taking a normal thing like a brass bowl and making it a god. This is taking holy things and making them profane. It's kind of the same sin, but a different direction. It's a sin that falls under the same commandment. Obviously, we read that from Acts, but from the opposite direction. Instead of treating mundane things as holy and worshiping them, this is treating holy and sacred things as mundane and profaning them. So the Greek word behind sacrilege is only used here in the New Testament. However, the root word from it is found in Acts 19:37, which says this: "For ye have brought hither these men, which are neither robbers of churches," that's the word, "nor yet blasphemers to your goddess." So the idea behind this word is that it is taking something away that is sacred to the church. So let's go through some examples of this. I was on the wrong thing. All right. So examples. Nope. So let me read to you an example. If you go to Daniel, you don't have to turn there, but Daniel 5:1-4. Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine before the 1,000. Belshazzar, whilst he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem. So these are the holy relics that were made to be part of temple worship. They were taken by Nebuchadnezzar when Jerusalem was conquered. That the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines might drink therein. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines drank them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. So Belshazzar, the king, brings the sacred things from the temple and just drinks them to impress his guests. That's profaning them. That's using them for an inappropriate use. And it's directly, and in verse 4, we see it's directly linked to the idolatry he was performing. The holy things were brought low to raise up the unholy things of his idols. He was comparing gods. He was saying, oh, look, this is the holy artifacts from Jehovah's temple. Look, here are the holy artifacts from Belshazzar's, whatever his gods were. See which one is better. And he's profaning one to elevate another. This is direct sacrilege. Another example of this, in the New Testament, Jesus and the money changers. So if you remember the story, he sees the money changers in the temple. They were performing, they were not treating the temple as it should have been. He crafts whips and beats them and drives them out. He drove them out of the temple because it was supposed to be sacred. He called it the house of prayer, and they were using it improperly. So usually the theft part of this story is what's focused on, but I don't think that's the correct way to look at it. He does call it a den of thieves, but that's not the real focus. Jesus did not whip people when they sinned in other cases or in other places. I'm sure there was plenty of other theft going on. In fact, he knew that Judas was stealing from themselves, and he didn't whip Judas. Why did he whip these people? Because they were performing a sin in a sacred place. It was a double sin, if you will. It was a direct violation of this commandment. He did not go out of his way to beat and to so forcibly put an end to sins that others were committing in any other place. Jesus paid special attention to how his Father's house was treated because it was sacred, even though he was going to put an end to all sacrifices and all temple worship in just a few years. So that's kind of interesting. The temple was very soon going to be done away with, but Jesus still said that it's important, it's valuable for worship, it's still needful at this time at the very least, it's still the Lord's house. And even though if he would have just waited a few years, it would have all been done away with, but he didn't. At the moment they were doing it, it was wrong for them to be using it improperly in that way. They were profaning its proper use. Let's see. But what about so this was a question from last trimester, what about using the church for mundane things, such as a meeting place or for a music recital? We had a music recital maybe a month ago or something. This, I would say, is perfectly fine because sacrilege has the idea of using a sacred thing in a degrading or disrespectful way. So if we use the building for bingo night, for example, or for a rock concert, it would be degrading to the purpose of the church. If you're using something as a function for the church, a music recital with appropriate music, that's perfectly fine. You're not degrading the use of the church in that way, especially since you're not using it during the service for that purpose. So an example in the New Testament, Jesus once used a fishing ship to preach to a multitude. The ship did not then become some sort of holy artifact that could only be used for preaching. No, they still use it for fishing afterwards. It seems perfectly normal that a thing can have dual use as long as one is not degrading to the other. I think that is perfectly normal. So examples of holy things for us today. So obviously we don't have the temple. What do we have? We have baptism. That is an important thing. That is a holy, sacred thing. It's an ordinance that we do in the church. When we baptize infants or the unsaved, we are taking something sacred and holy and treating it with irreverence by defeating its intended purpose. If we are preaching baptismal regeneration, we are profaning the teaching of baptism. That's sacrilege, among other things. If you do this, so this is from the Babylon Bee. It's not real, but it's very funny. Elevation Church is one of these big mega churches, so they do ridiculous things like this, but they don't do this. So if you make a water slide out of your baptism, if you go to some water park and say, we're going to baptize the whole church, and as they go down the slide, you make a little thing, and that's sacrilege. That's wrong. That's evil. So when you treat it flippantly, it can have the same results as treating it with wrong doctrine. You are still profaning a sacred thing. Another example is the Lord's Supper. We talked about this a little earlier. Same as baptism, but with a different meaning and purpose. The Bible even says in 1 Corinthians 11, 20 through 22 and 26 through 27 that if you eat it improperly, if you eat it unworthily, if you don't prepare your heart in the proper way for it, then there are consequences to that. And why are there consequences? Because it's a holy thing. And you should not profane holy things. That is the second commandment. That's a outgrowth of the second commandment. Obviously, the Eucharist is a double violation, if you would. The church service itself, this is a holy thing. This is an important thing that God commands us to do. You should all pay attention to this. You should all make time to be here. We'll talk about that in a different lesson. The Bible, obviously, is sacred. Treat it properly, and obviously use it. And prayer. Prayer is obviously sacred. There's a lot of other things. These are just some examples I could pull up, but these are all sacred things that you need to treat with reverence and weight. But don't take it too far. Don't step into the other side, which is idolatry. Don't worship baptism. Don't worship the Lord's Supper. Use them appropriately. All right, so putting it all together very quickly, unfortunately, we're going to look at what improper or proper worship is. So God has given us rules to follow when we worship him. Some of these rules even existed before the law was written, like Cain and Abel. So the first sin ever recorded after the fall was Cain's improper sacrifice to God. So this is Genesis 4, 3 through 5. And in the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought the fruit of the ground, an offering unto the Lord. And Abel, he also brought of the firstlings of his flock, and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering, but unto Cain and his offering he had not respect. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. So there was the first game of Super Smash Brothers happened right after that, and Abel lost. So it's interesting, though, that the first violation of the sixth commandment, murder, was brought about by the first violation of the second commandment, even though neither commandment existed. So this is interesting. We're going to find that this is a common pattern. These commands are not new things given in Exodus 20. These are pre-existing commands that were always true, like we had for our that which fits into our moral framework. Right? All moral commands are eternal because they represent the eternal nature of God. So in this case, improper worship was Cain's sin. Also, it's interesting to note, Cain was not worshiping a different God. He was worshiping the correct God incorrectly. So it's also interesting that I find that fascinating. It's not that whatever you do to worship God is not automatically acceptable to God. He has a proper way to do things, and you should follow that. So this gives us proper worship. We see that in the Old Testament a lot. Lots of rules in the Old Testament for proper worship. But for the New Testament, what do we have? We have regular assembly in the church. These are just some examples. So this is Hebrews 10:25, which says, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. Don't forsake this assembly right here. You're all assembled. That's good. That's correct. Don't forsake that. Don't skip church for whatever reason happens to be happening. This is a very important thing. This is a sacred thing. To skip it is to profane it. Prayer is a proper part of worship. There's lots of examples where Jesus was praying with his disciples in worship. Sacred music. Last week, Chad taught on sacred music. We're going to sing the Psalter this morning. These are very interesting things. Our hymns are also sacred musics. These are good things, and this is part of worship. Don't treat them flippantly. Give them the proper respect that they're due. Baptism we looked at, and the Lord's Supper we looked at. These are all proper things that must be done properly, not just to do them, but to do them correctly. What are examples of improper worship? Online church. It's not wrong for you to be at home and to watch the service like all of you watching right now. That's not wrong necessarily. If you can avoid staying home, you must. The command is to assemble. the command is to not forsake the assembly. Now, if you're homesick, you are not forsaking the assembly. You have been prevented from assembling. That's not actually the command. The command is not that you must always assemble. The command is that you do not forsake the assembly. So there's plenty of teaching on that, but I'm not going to go into it. Worldly music in the church is improper forms of worship. I think all CCM, Chad had a really good class on this. Improper ways to worship God. You are not worshiping God. You're profaning him. You're profaning sacred music by adding on worldly music to sacred lyrics, if you will, even if the lyrics are fine, which often they're not. And of course, idolatry. Worshiping God through idols is inappropriate. Worshiping anything through idols is inappropriate. But having icons, images, art that points to God is appropriate. We just must carefully toe that line. All right, so now let's see how it fits into our moral framework. Remember, we had this framework we were looking at very briefly. So what does this command teach us about God? First, it teaches us that he is not created, unlike other gods. We didn't really touch about this much, but God does not need you to fashion him out of an idol like Baal or all the other ones. The golden calf did not exist before Aaron created it. Obviously, God does not need that. He is not created. He is self-sufficient. That is literally his name. He does not need a physical representation to speak through. So like the idols in the Old Testament would often have priests that would speak for them and such. He doesn't need that. He speaks directly to us through his word, through his son, and through his prophets, and sometimes by himself in person. You can read Exodus 20:22 through 23, where God says that he speaks to them from heaven directly, or at least to Moses. We also learn that he is holy and should be treated as such. So he himself is holy. Don't make images, don't worship images that are poor representations of him either. Maybe that's another good point. If you're going to make an image of something, make it a good image. Don't make it a poor image of the thing. I do think it's somewhat inappropriate to have an image of God, but if you're going to have an image of an Old Testament character or an event, that's fine. But give it its proper reverence. Don't step over the line. God is holy and should be treated as such. And he wants our worship. He definitely wants our worship. We looked at that in the first commandment, but he has special terms. He has very specific ways he wants us to worship him. So what does this command teach us about us? We are in God's image. That's an interesting thing. That was our purpose. We were created in his image and likeness. So as his image, we should always point to God and not to ourselves. We are naturally inclined to make visible, tangible things for worship. And sometimes this could be a good thing if we're using it to worship God, but it's a bad thing if we're worshiping the thing itself. So we have to draw that line carefully. We can construct our own method of worship. This is another thing that's obviously it's a corollary of the you must worship him properly, therefore there are improper ways to worship, and we do a good job of making bad ways to worship God. And often this reflects what we want to get from God and not what he wants from us. So CCM, charismatic movement, these kind of things, they're more focused on what we want out of the worship and not what God wants out of the worship. What does this teach us about good and evil? Creating and enjoying images, statues, and icons are not the sin themselves. Worshiping them is the sin. I think we beat that to death. We should give proper respect to sacred people, practices, and things, but we don't step over the line into worship. It is good to worship God, but only in the right way. So it is not enough to worship God. We must worship him properly. John 4 says we must worship him in spirit and in truth. So there are rules. So applications, so practical outcomes. If we practice this command, we will shun idols. That's good. We will create and honor God through art, which is also very good. Christianity has a long history of creating very good, very beautiful art, and I think that's a very good thing. We will have proper veneration for holy things in and out of the church, and we will have proper worship of God. So how do we do this? First, don't have idols, very clearly. No bathtub Marys in your yard. Don't worship anything or anyone but God. Don't pray to anything but God. Enjoy art as a thing that can point to God, but don't give undue deference to that art. Don't worship it. Don't treat it as if it is God itself. Be careful and deliberate in your worship and follow God's specified rules. and worship God on his terms. These are all kind of ways we can apply this commandment. And so I'm over time, but that was it. That was the second commandment. Next week we'll do the third one, which is interesting. And you're all dismissed. If you have questions, you can ask after.